Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of OpenObservability Talks. I'm Dr. Horowitz, and here at OpenObservability Talks, we talk about anything open, DevOps, open source, and observability. You can find it on all your popular podcast apps, and we also stream live the episode on YouTube and Twitch. So do tune in if you haven't done that in the previous episodes, and you can type in your questions, comments, and take active part in the episode. That's much more fun. For those who are today on the live stream, do feel free to share questions, comments, and we'll try to get to those after our chat or during the chat and combine it within the conversation. I'd like to thank our sponsors, logs.io, for backing the podcast and enabling this. And one important thing, if you have something interesting that you want to share, if you want to be on this podcast and share some subject matter expertise that you have on these domains, then feel free to submit a CFP. Go to openobservability.io and submit your proposal. More than happy to have more people involved. You can also reach out over Twitter at OpenObserve, or directly to me at Horowitz, Horovits. More than welcome to hear. And with that, let's move on to today's episode. And today I have a very special guest. I have Richard Hartmann. Richard is a director of community at Grafana Labs, but he's also a Prometheus team member, an OpenMetrics founder. He's on the CNCF SIG Observability, the chair, now Tag Observability, and many other roles within the CNCF and the open source world. So he'll definitely share a lot of perspectives. And let me bring Richie into the stream. Hey, Richie, good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Great to have you. You're joining from Europe, right?
Yes, Munich.
Great. So maybe you've done so many things on so many fronts. Maybe a word about yourself and how you came about to be in the open source world in general and the CNCF in particular.
That's a very wide question. The open source.
Just the short version of the intro on yourself.
Yeah, okay, that's easier. Let me restart. How I came into open source is actually like 20 years ago. Just getting started with Linux and finding that interesting, and I've never stopped. And as a lot of this was around communities and still is around communities, that's what got me to stay around. Like those interdependencies of humans and how they work together and all those things, like that's what got me initially. As to the monitoring and observability part, most of my professional life I've been working at ISPs, as in doing infrastructure work, which is totally thankless, and I need to be invisible, and services must be invisible, because else everyone will complain, because they only see them break. So I really depended a lot on monitoring, being on point. That's where this other part of the passion is coming from. And you summarize what my
we'll touch more about what you do currently, because you touch on so many different things. So we'll cover that. But I think I would like to start with the great news that we had just recently with OpenTelemetry getting accepted to the incubation and the CNCF and by the TOC, the Technical Oversight Committee, and specifically, I know that this is relevant for you because the SIG Observability that you chair led the due diligence process, so you're intimately familiar with how it came to become to be graduate into incubation or mature into incubation. Sorry. So maybe you can explain to the audience what exactly it means to be a sandbox project, what it means incubation, and maybe what's heading next.
So there's 3 stages within CNCF for projects. That is sandbox, incubation, and graduated. Sandbox is not like there are relatively few requirements on joining as a sandbox project to give space where basically develop themselves and gain adoption and gain traction and find usefulness. The incubation requirement is basically that you have found, at least in part, that usefulness, because you are stable enough and you have the momentum and everything that you seem to be a project which is going to be around for a while and will deliver value to the end users. And graduation obviously is like the gold star of that thing, is actually like proper and stable and can be highly recommended, blah, blah, blah. That's the rough life cycle.
And of course, the most famous one under the CNCF and the first one to have graduated is Kubernetes. So if anyone doesn't know anything in the ecosystem, definitely they heard about Kubernetes. That is the first project to have graduated. And afterwards, Prometheus, that we've discussed several times in the podcast, and we'll talk about this more today. So just to refer to some projects that probably are more familiar. And I guess beyond that, or maybe step back about OpenTelemetry, can you? I find a lot of confusion when I talk to people about OpenTelemetry, because OpenTelemetry, people think what's the state of OpenTelemetry? OpenTelemetry is now GA or not GA? Is it beta or not? And they don't understand that it's actually an aggregate of multiple components, each one run by a separate group with its own maturity life cycle. So maybe you can help us explain a bit what's the structure and what are the different components and the life cycle of each, and what we need to actually ask if you want to try out OpenTelemetry.
So there's several different axes along which you can split OpenTelemetry. The most important ones to me are the signals and the languages. Where the signals are split into traces, metrics, and logs in their case in this order. And languages are obviously the various implementations for those signals per language, which already gives you a tuple of combinations. You have various other aspects. You have the data format, you have wire format, which are sub-components of the signals, obviously. You have the collector, which is standing somewhat distinct, but obviously, again, interrelates with all the rest, because you need your complete pipeline of being able to actually write in the language which you're choosing about the signal, which you want to do, which you want to observe. Then you need the collector and the complete pipeline, the processing, until at some point you end at the storage backend. So the two things which you always need to check at the minimum are the state of the signal and of the language you're interested in. As part of the incubation process of OpenTelemetry, they created an overview site, opentelemetry.io/status. We can also probably link this from show notes or some such.
I'll put it on the chat for the ones that are on the live stream.
And there you can see the self-assessment overview of the current state.
Yeah, sounds good. And I think you disassembled it correctly, but essentially, what I found, again, if you need to understand what's the language in which you program. So you need the SDK, the client libraries for this, and understand what's the maturity. Obviously, the protocol side, if you use OTLP, the proprietary one, or something more common or more mature, and the collector. Actually, the collector is not GA, I think, for any, even not for tracing. So it's this one is still experimental, I think, for both metrics and traces, as far as I remember. And but many use it. So the question is to understand what's the maturity level of the pieces in the collector that you need to use for your processing. And how do you see the community adoption around this? And it's a very successful project, very nice graphs showing the adoption, but you're there in the trenches. What do you hear about the adoption, even more so about the actual participation in the project?
I think adoption, you need to split into tracing and everything else. Tracing is superb. It's what we use. It's what, like if you talk to anyone at Grafana Labs and such, that's what we really recommend to be used, because it is the gold standard in tracing, which we have in the space. Which leads to confusion, because metrics is approaching a state where you can actually really use it. Logs are little bit further out from what I know. And there is some, there is user confusion around trying to use everything at once and then not yet being able to. This will hopefully improve. As to participation, that is a super wide and open and remarkably spread and structured effort. It's honestly hard to get into it. At least I found it like it's simple to join the calls and everything, but to actually understand how everything interrelates and such is quite the challenge, which is obviously even more important if you're trying to help with the specification and the standardization and the interoperability of the thing, as opposed to just using it. So yeah, but
what's your understanding, by the way, of where so tracing is pretty mature? You mentioned that you even use that in Grafana Labs. We also use that at Logs.io. But where do metrics stand as far as you know?
Getting there. There is. I can cheat and just look at it because I opened it a second ago. API are draft, SDK are draft, protocol is stable, and collector is experimental. My own main work, like I joined OpenTelemetry officially as a member for the, half a year ago, we created a Prometheus working group within OpenTelemetry with the focus of OpenTelemetry becoming Prometheus compatible for obvious reasons. I personally would not be using the client libraries, but I'm highly biased. Of course, I'm coming from Prometheus, so I am very opinionated about the happy path of how metrics can be done and what is important, and basically using those well-tested code bases, which have been a lot of testing over the last half decade or so. But that's not to say that OpenTelemetry will not also get there. Like I fully expect it to.
But do you say that we'd expect it to GA within the coming year, or do you not see that? I know that logging is farther behind, but is metrics to the extent that you understand? I know it's as you said draft, but practically is that getting closer to being to getting stable state within a year's time, or do you not expect it to be so?
It's definitely getting closer, and it's getting closer all the time as the official timeline keeps moving. Or like I've actively worked with them for years, even with open census and such before this. I just don't make predictions about any of this.
Yeah, the experience told you not to do that, which is fine. By the way, you mentioned open census. I think it's maybe for the listeners, it's worthwhile noting that open census and open tracing that mentioned before are sort of the predecessor preceding open standards that were merged into OpenTelemetry. So just to make these buzzwords align. So if anyone used open census before, it should find compatibility within and the future path within OpenTelemetry. And similarly, if anyone had already instrumentation based on for tracing based on open tracing, again, the future path is OpenTelemetry with backwards compatibility. So just to help people. And the other open asterisk in the realm is OpenMetrics. So maybe you can help us decipher all the open asterisks, and then we can talk about OpenMetrics.
First thing, if anyone feels confused about all the open stuff, don't feel bad about this. It's a very common occurrence that people are super confused about this. We can also maybe link to this from the show notes. It's so bad that even in the context of the CNCF TOC, I did an explainer on what all the opens are, because it's just super confusing. And I mean, this thing is called OpenObservability. The GitHub org in which OpenMetrics lives is called OpenObservability. You have other things like OpenTSDB and Open Search and Open blah, 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 blah. There's tons of open. For the intents and purposes of right here, I think you already did a pretty good job of explaining this, where open tracing and open census merged into OpenTelemetry. So you can, at some point in the near future, disregard open tracing and open census unless you need them for migration reasons, but the future is OpenTelemetry, plain and simple. OpenMetrics, the name was first. Of all the ones which we are now talking about, I just need to point this out.
That's why we couldn't call it in short OT, because OT was already occupied for open tracing, so you had to shorten OpenTelemetry to OTel. That's an anecdote from the community.
No, I mean for the OpenMetrics name. That is actually the first of those opens we are currently talking about. That is an effort to standardize the Prometheus exposition format. And that goes way back. It predates things like conformance programs and such within CNCF. I mean, if we were starting this today, we would probably be doing this under the conformance label of CNCF, which is there for Kubernetes and which will be released for Prometheus very soon. It's basically standardizing what Prometheus does on the wire from an instrumentation or from an exporter. Let me just close that window. To the ingester. In the meantime, we obviously have other ones as well, where you have, for example, Prometheus Remote Write, which is also transporting the same information, already sanitized and cleaned up to some extent, or to quite some extent by Prometheus, and then sending it on to backend storages or long-term storages. Like those are, that's the high level. So OpenMetrics itself is just standardizing the exposition format.
So just to recap, make sure that I understand and the audience. So essentially, it's something that started off as a Prometheus internal format, or not internal, but Prometheus, part of Prometheus format. But then the decision was to make it a standalone, a standard or exposition format outside the context of Prometheus. Although obviously Prometheus will support it, so that broader ecosystem would be able to communicate based on that format, right?
Ish. I mean, you would always have been able to communicate based on that standard already, and the Prometheus exposition format version 04 was stable since 2014, and it's still working. So that is not too much of a problem. There's a political component where back then, a lot of projects and vendors just didn't want to support anything with Prometheus in the name. Shout out to InfluxDB, who were the first to actually switch and said, okay, we'll just simply support this and go all in. And at around this time, CNCF approached Prometheus team about, hey, would you be willing to make this its distinct standard as a distinct project? I had similar thoughts around the whole thing and was trying to convince Prometheus team of the same, and that is where the whole thing started.
That's part of the community. Also, the sensitivities of other competing projects that want to use pieces and to make these pieces reusable and neutral. Let's say, I think it's a value in its own right when you understand the intricacies of a community, I guess.
Yes. And I mean, OpenMetrics, you see, like there is this notion that this is just doing what Prometheus does. But if you look at the actual history and at the actual differences, there's major parts coming from Google, initially from an attempt to get OpenCensus and OpenMetrics to join forces and to merge. Things like exemplars and such come from this. Uber, M3DB back then, and they still, like now with Chronosphere, like there is actually quite a bit of work beyond just Prometheus going into OpenMetrics and actually covering a lot of different needs in a carefully evolved standard.
Nice. That's an important value. And maybe we talked about before about OpenTelemetry. Can you help us clarify how these two projects and standards in a way intertwine and work together?
So historically, not a lot. As of this year, early this year, this changed substantially with Prometheus working group. Like that's part of what I meant with it can be hard to work and get an overview of how OpenTelemetry works, even if you're in the space. Ever since that Prometheus working group has been formed, and here I need to shout out for Lolita, that it has been a lot more streamlined and a lot better. Lolita Sharma from AWS. Basically, OpenTelemetry is working for full compatibility with Prometheus. is one of the stated goals, which currently means two main interfaces from the perspective of OpenTelemetry. The one is OpenMetrics as the exposition format, and the other is Prometheus Remote Write. Those are distinct from how OpenTelemetry does it internally. Like as you mentioned earlier, they have OTLP and such, which are their own happy path, which they consider the primary way of transporting metrics, which is totally fine, like absolutely fine. Yet there's also this hard goal of attaining and then maintaining Prometheus compatibility for obvious ecosystem reasons.
So essentially, the SDK being able to export as OpenMetrics format, and also the collector to be able to receive an OpenMetrics and then export as the Prometheus Remote Write. Is that something along these lines?
Yes, precisely. I think also receiving Prometheus Remote Write and sending it on as Prometheus Remote Write is on the roadmap, but I'm not certain what the status of this is. But I think the intention is also to be able to ingest Prometheus Remote Write and to also emit it. It might already be possible. I honestly just don't know. That's part of what we touched earlier with this collector and pipeline approach, where you have this quite complex piece in the middle to actually redistribute your data, your observability data as needed and as required.
Yeah. And there are great news around the OpenMetrics. It also we talked about the OpenTelemetry applying for moving on from sandbox to incubation. OpenMetrics also applied to move from sandbox to incubation. And again, due diligence. You steered it with the tag observability or SIG observability, and obviously then to the TOC.
There's one important point to make, and that's something I'm super careful about. I wear so many hats, and I'm always very particular about which hat I'm wearing at what particular time. So for the maybe one line of context for SIG observability back then, TOC and us agreed we do due diligence more thoroughly and earlier than other SIGs as a little bit of a test balloon, which worked out, but also was a ton of work. That has completely been changed, the due diligence process. But when we were still with the SIG observability hat on, still doing those in-depth due diligences and arrived at OpenMetrics, obviously, I recused myself 100%. I'm not the chair, I'm a co-chair, and Matt basically took over the chairing, and I spoke solely as a member of OpenMetrics and not as the SIG observability chair. Because this is super important. I cannot possibly, with my Prometheus or OpenMetrics hats on, discuss anything OpenTelemetry in SIG or now tag observability. This must happen with the chair head, because else it's super important to be really specific about what angle you're taking and what point of view you're arguing or talking from, because else.
I can testify firsthand from participating in some of the SIG observability meetings that you're always very clear on which hat you wear, and to make it very clear for the participants on how they can approach you and what kinds of expectation setting is on the table. So that's really appreciated to make this process really professional. And due diligence should be a due diligence, and obviously someone who has angle into the project at hand. It makes a lot of sense. So it was handed off to the TOC, and I think now it's open for voting. And on the parallel path, OpenMetrics is also applying as a standard for IETF. So maybe you can help us understand all these different the state of the project and all these different initiatives to take it into a standard path.
So from the standard level itself, it's pretty much done. That's what we published like half a year ago, a little bit longer. There are bits and pieces which we need to improve, like unclarities in language and such, and we have honestly a little bit of a backlog which we need to get through. From the IETF side, I come from ISP background, as I mentioned earlier, and I care a lot more about open standards and actually clean interoperability without any vendors trying to play stupid games or so. I'm a strong believer in open source, and I mean this in all the old free Libre sense. But part of this means unless you can actually take your data and have your software interoperate and take your data and move it somewhere else, a lot of those freedoms don't actually give you a lot because you're still locked into one piece of software, as opposed to being able to choose freely between different types of software or different implementations, different languages, what have you. Those kinds of things. As such, I believe in having open standards which are freely accessible, not the ISO play where you have to pay like €500 to just read the standard, but where everyone can just download the PDF or Markdown these days and just read the thing and start implementing against it, where all the tests are fully open, where you don't have anything like, oh, no worries, you need to pay X amount of money, and then we take this into this hidden box and something comes out and maybe you pass and maybe you don't. Aggressively open. That is the underlying thing. And the most aggressively open and also due diligence in reviewing submissions is IETF. And that is how the internet functions, and I consider how Prometheus works as part of how the internet functions. So yeah, that's where this is coming from, and that's why we submitted it. That's currently under submission. The last question was about the future. The major change, which we already anticipated when releasing it, when releasing OpenMetrics, was high-resolution histograms. Björn Rabenstein is working on that and has been working on this for quite some time, and this proposal is quite superb, if I do say so myself. It's now been implemented in a branch in the Prometheus repo, so anyone can test this. OpenTelemetry also is looking at implementing precisely this high-resolution histogram. There's like bits and pieces around details, but my last status from last week is that OpenTelemetry accepts to accept this standard for high resolution histograms, and obviously with my OpenMetrics hat on, this will then be standardized in OpenMetrics as well. Yeah.
Nice. So you say, and the move to sort of the status as an incubation project, is that expected to change any specific adoption efforts or anything else, or you're just going forward with the roadmap?
Procedurally speaking, once you have incubation status, you get PR support, you get more airtime at KubeCon and such. Like those kinds of things happen once you are in incubating stage, but that is completely independent of the standardization work of the wire format to me.
Sounds good. So maybe we mentioned briefly the involvement of the SIG observability or the tag observability. Actually, this evening we have another meeting of the group. Okay, what exactly is the mission statement of this, and what other types of activities, main activities, are done there?
I don't have the mission statement by heart, but we can link to it from the show notes.
The informal one.
Yes, precisely. It's basically about enabling people to self-onboard into the space, because it is super confusing, and to try and work towards interoperability between the different projects. Also putting out content which helps people again with the self-onboarding. We have more and more end users joining SIG or tag observability. which is super nice because we need more of those perspectives. Historically, it was mainly driven by projects, like the actual incubated and graduated projects within CNCF. But that is becoming wider and wider. We also saw participation from the IRTF, which is the Internet Research Task Force, which is again one of those super nice interplays where you just build connections between all the different groups of people trying to make computers easier to not have on fire all the time.
Actually, I think this is an interesting topic. We discussed it a bit before the episode when we chatted the community side of things, because you are involved. I mean, even cover all the projects that you're involved with. I think by now all the listeners understand that your hands are all over the place. And so you have a broad understanding of the ecosystem, of the different communities, the interrelationship between them. So how do you see these the communities, the structure? How do we keep these different communities and the different initiatives in line, aligning on governance, consistency on the different projects? Can you give us your take on that?
You will not ever be able to keep communities in line. That's not going to happen. And that being said, you have two main components to. Okay, let me restart. At the core of any community, you have the fact that those communities are driven by a shared passion. It doesn't matter what that is, but there is something shared why those people want to be together for whatever reason. It's coming from an intrinsic motivation, as opposed to a company where you have a lot of extrinsic motivation, like, for example, the fact that you get paid and you can afford food and shelter. You don't have this in the true community sense. It gets a little bit murky once money is involved, and obviously the cloud space has quite a bit of money involved. So this pure community aspect is not as strong as in many other open source communities, or not the dominating factor, but it's still very strong. Like, make no mistake about that one. And then you need basically two things. You need to protect this group of people, and we talk about the protection in a second, and you also need to give them the ability to thrive and to build friendships and to actually do whatever the community itself wants to do. So it's not about making a community go in a certain direction or so. It's about providing the canvas onto which the community can paint itself, so to speak. The protection aspect is super important. Like, these days, a lot of those fights have already been fought and won. Like, code of conduct are a thing which are at least required on paper, and many communities actually take them seriously. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And it's super important that when you have those, that you take them seriously. They can even be informal, and a lot of the older communities tend to have informal structures, but they need to be taken super, super seriously. And you need to, on the one hand, make certain that if someone makes a mistake or so, that can happen, and that is completely fine. On the other hand, if there is a pattern or if there is deliberate overstepping or something, it needs to be dealt with consistently, quickly, under published and logical and easy to predict rules. Like, it should be easy for any community member to predict the outcome of a not good situation. And that is important. Like, it's important for the offenders because they know it will happen if there is consistent enforcement. It's even more important for the people who are not the offenders. They might not be on the receiving side, just on the observing side, but even then, it is something which will kill the community over time. So unless you have this permanent upkeep work in the background of communities, you have a few players who are not super nice, and they drag everyone else down, and then it devolves. Once a community is stable and happy and healthy, they have a lot of self-protection mechanisms, but still they are not super guarded against this, like not 100% guarded against this. But once you have something which is up and running and you have this self-sustaining community, it's a lot more resilient than if things are new. And a lot of this obviously really political science and into how society large works, but I mean that's kind of obvious because it's groups of people trying to have a structure to interact, and that always gets you to the same page.
Yeah, it's a community. It's not called community for no reason. It's a community just like a community that shares a physical place to live, or a shelter, or a workspace. And this community shares a joint project. And the other side of things is how to create this cross-project, cross-pollination, the cross-contribution. First of all, obviously, I at least think that the bottom-up approach of having people such as yourself and Bartek that was on this podcast, and others that are in different projects and sort of have a bigger view beyond the specific narrow project into cross-cutting concerns, let's put it this way, contribute to that. How do you see that part, and obviously other means of creating this cross-project proliferation?
Cross-pollination, proliferation are very much different in this regard, but let me answer differently. I hope this covers your question. You always have a lot of people working together, and as a rule, any given community does not really care about that other community. Members of the community might, and they would then become parts of both of those communities, but communities rarely merge. In particular, of course, they are not extrinsically forced to, like by a company or some such. So they usually exist, they spring up, they exist, and they wither and die independently of each other. But there's obviously still a lot of interconnections, and those interconnections, as I just said, are more on the personal level, not so much on the community level. There are obvious overlaps, and there are obvious things where projects would work together and such. Like that part is obvious, but it's often about the people who are doing this, and there you come to intrinsic motivation yet again. We won't have the time here. We can maybe link to this from the show notes. I did something ages ago on community or on observability. I think it was even the first one, but it went deep into how to talk about stuff to different people. Like you have this big picture in your head, and that big picture is relevant because you need this to know where you actually want to go. Like things like, for example, Grafana Loki is something which I literally have wanted for half a decade now. Same for Tempo. Not quite as long, but like maybe a year shorter, but you need this big picture of where you actually want to end up. But then it's super important to be able to take bits and pieces of that big picture and show the relevant parts to the different people. I can talk to an engineer about that one library or that one function, or how that one API call in that library having similar properties to that other API call in that other library, and how that makes everything easier. And I can probably talk about this for an hour with an engineer over beer. I cannot do the same with most CEOs. Because they just don't care. Like I can talk about how you have synergies and how you have more equivalent process execution, blah 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 blah. Like, but processes you're already in managing or manager area. The product people will care about having their KPIs, and they don't care if someone else calls them SLI or not. Like a lot of those things are just about trying to see the perspective of the other parts of the community which you are trying to convince or to get on board or to share an effort or what have you. And then use the language and use the pictures in which that part of the community thinks and communicates, and building this bridge of shared understanding. Which, jumping super widely back, is why I like Grafana so much, because that enables you to have super disparate teams who are not working together normally, and they share the same dashboard, and as such, automatically they start sharing the same language. Automatically they start pooling their islands of institutional knowledge, because they create this one dashboard together and improve it together, as opposed to everyone having their own system and not even being able to log into the other groups thing, which is also how Prometheus, like, you give all the data of all your stack. And I mean this, if you have a more traditional company, literally from the generators of your data center down to the microservice and everything in between. And you give everyone who cares to look this ability to get this holistic understanding, share that knowledge, share that language, share this understanding of that thing. Obviously, not everyone cares about this. So a lot of this is about identifying the people who actually care. And it's always the same people. The same is for organizing conferences and such. It's always the same people who show up. You sometimes don't meet someone for literally a decade, and then you meet again and you're still basically doing the same stuff which you've done a decade ago, and they're also still doing the same stuff they've done a decade ago. Happens all the time.
That's amazing. And you mentioned Prometheus, so maybe I think most of the audience knows Prometheus, but maybe you can tell us, you're in the details, what is the current state of the project, maybe what's upcoming, at least the major items that are coming in the roadmap?
The current state, but I'm biased, is quite good. I mean, if I do say so myself, Prometheus is the standard in the cloud native ecosystem. There's lots of other projects and lots of other vendors. I mean, Prometheus is not a vendor, but Prometheus is the standard, and as other projects have realized, you need to actually be interoperable with Prometheus to really be to really gain traction in the cloud native space. The same is true way beyond just cloud native, in particular in fields like ISPs and such. Also, a lot of industrial control and such are also using Prometheus. I mean, I have more insights there because that's where I came from, like working for ISPs, having built a data center and such. That's the type of people I know better than others. So it is currently the thing to align with. And a lot of our roadmap, a lot of our future is the logical conclusion out of there, or from that realization. A lot of this work is about self-care and making it easier to hold and operate, because we always see new waves, not always, but you regularly see new waves of adoption for projects. Like if you're on the inside, you really see that there is this wave of new type of user. And obviously, as we gain more and more traction, more and more users who don't consider observability interesting in the least are entering the space. They want that thing to work. Tap water comes out the wall. They don't care how. It just needs to work. That obviously has an interplay with cloud vendors having as a service stuff in the observability space, but it also means that a lot of the bits and pieces of being able to run and maintain Prometheus are important. So a lot of this is around synthetic sugar, making things easier. Also fundamental changes, like for example, high resolution histograms. There's performance work. There is database work. There's the agent, which is again in this that's at the intersection of making it easier to operate in certain scenarios, and also and having an even easier way to bridge into this cloud and as a service space. Yeah, you have the conformance program. You have
That's an interesting part, I think. Maybe dedicating a few words, because you said that Prometheus becoming, I guess, a de facto standard, as you said, and looking also back at Kubernetes becoming a de facto standard for containerization, and then having the conformance program there. I think it's an important learning that we got from that experience. Can you share with us a bit about the conformance program for Prometheus?
So current plan is the conformance program will be formally announced at KubeCon North America. Like you can find everything in the public. It's all in GitHub. We can probably link this from the show notes. But the conformance program is basically specifying that from the CNCF's point of view, there are certain tests for certain interfaces defined by Prometheus team. And if and only if you reach compatibility or compliance with those interfaces, you can call yourself Prometheus compatible. There will be a mark, and you have like a little logo which you can put on your website or your collaterals or what have you. And this is basically to once again reduce confusion in the market or end user confusion around what actually supports what does work, what does not work, what can I expect. Because basically everyone is talking about how there are Prometheus and OpenMetrics and PromQL and everything compliant and compatible, and some really are and some really are not. I mean,
so essentially going forward, whoever wants to say I'm Prometheus compatible or I'm OpenMetrics compatible or similar will actually, this will have a definition of what this compatibility means, which is essentially boils down to a set of tests that confirm that, right?
Yes. Prometheus currently defines 3 interfaces to test, or we define a lot more interfaces, but we have tests for 3 interfaces. Those are OpenMetrics, Prometheus Remote Write, and PromQL. With varying degrees of automation such to the test suite, because obviously it's a lot easier to test Prometheus Remote Write than it is to test PromQL. Yeah. The more you go into the details, the less you can fully automate anyway, because sometimes it needs human context and consideration if that is considered in line or not. And that's obviously something we are working on to reduce as much as possible. And anyone who is listening to this and working at a vendor who has interest in being compliant, please try and work upstream in the actual tests, because you're uplifting everyone in the complete ecosystem. So yeah, please work on this and actually shape how those tests run. That benefits you, and it should be an easy sell to your management. But also, it's a good way to give back to the wider community. Yeah, and basically once you have 100% with those, you can call yourself Prometheus compatible. And as per usual in the business world, a lot of this is done through trademarks. Of course, by trademarking that term and extending the trademark of an existing term, you can actually prevent people from using certain words. You can prevent them from using the logos which you created. And those are the carrots which you dangle in front of the business decision makers to actually attain proper compliance and proper compatibility with the respective interfaces or Prometheus itself.
And it's important to clarify, these are trademarks that are under the CNCF. Unlike vendor-owned projects, here it's actually CNCF that has the ownership of these trademarks and these logos and everything else. And essentially, CNCF grants you the certification and then grants you with that the approval to use these logos respectively.
Yes. So the way this works on the inside is basically CNCF asks Prometheus team what we are happy with when it comes to the conformance program, what tests we want, blah, blah, blah. All of this is done on our side. But again, more than happy to have external contributors. And then this is formally recognized by CNCF. If we are completely speaking legally, that's actually on the Linux Foundation's plate. Of course, the CNCF is a sub-foundation of the Linux Foundation, and trademarks are held in the Linux Foundation, not in CNCF itself. But all of this are basically just the janitorial bits and pieces, which I find super interesting, but most people probably don't.
Yeah, I agree. There are actually 2 other projects that I wanted to mention in this context. We won't have too much time to delve, but at least to mention in the CNCF ecosystem that pertain directly to the Prometheus context, which are Cortex and Thanos, that are essentially time series databases that can provide long-term storage for Prometheus to enable larger volume, scalable, and historical queries and so on. Can you tell us a bit about the mission statement of these projects, especially in the context of Prometheus and maybe where they stand?
So let's flip this. Both of them started from within Prometheus, which is different to all the other long-term storage solutions for Prometheus. And long-term storage is a little bit of a misnomer these days because you have super sturdy long-term storage within Prometheus itself. Like personally speaking, I started having long-term data in Prometheus in 2015. So that tells you how stable it is if you actually hold it right. But since huge improvements to just keeping your data in Prometheus. And also re-importing and such, like re-importing data in these instances. All that being said, there are a lot of reasons to have remote storages, but those are not so much around just long-term or just long-term storage anymore. They are about scalability in other ways. In particular, scaling your storage and scaling your queries. Thanos initially started as horizontally scaling the storage layer on block-based storage to basically have a lot of cheap and highly redundant and available storage. Whereas Cortex started on the query and ingestion layer. Initially just the query layer, then shortly after the ingestion as well. So the initial focus was a lot more around fast queries. Obviously, not obviously, Cortex has switched over from the chunks model over to block-based storage, and that is coming from Thanos. Same as Thanos is looking at what Cortex did and reusing bits and pieces to make the query and ingester and such of Thanos more scalable. Because there is this interplay where people give and take between the projects. Yeah. So that is those two. The special part about them, again, is that they are coupled closely to Prometheus. Of course, you have people who are on Cortex team and on Prometheus team. You have people who are on Thanos team and are on Prometheus team. And funnily enough, the same coupling exists for Kubernetes, where I think I think it's two people, tech leads of the SIG instrumentation at Kubernetes is part of Prometheus team, where you also have this interplay. And like us trying to standardize all our interfaces and to have super hard guarantees around stability, and then even going beyond those promises and even keeping experimental stuff stable for years and years and years, so you don't have breaking changes, which is one of the often overlooked properties of Prometheus, and one of the reasons I think why we have so much success, that you don't have to have a breaking change in every minor release. We really try hard to make it easy to interoperate with Prometheus. Yet it is obvious that if you're part of Prometheus team, you can shape the future of the project a lot more easily than if you're an outsider. Anyone listening to this and wanting to have that same power, contribute upstream, become member of Prometheus team. All doors are open. So this is not us spiking the ground against anyone else. This is just me recognizing that factually speaking, it's obviously easier for Cortex and Thanos to enact change as they see fit, because they're already working within Prometheus as well, which is not the case for the other long-term storage solutions, which would be probably a good incentive to talk to your manager and tell them to assign 1 to 5 people to Prometheus team and upstream that work.
Yeah, we had a past episode where we had a guest from Chronosphere and also a member of the M3DB, another open source time series database that is outside of the CNCF sphere, but is also with the mission to provide similar services to Prometheus. I want to have, maybe looking back, we talked about so many different components and different projects, and I would like to ask you, how does it all fit together? How can people actually get value out of the system and the aggregate of projects, and how it benefits humans beyond all the tech words around it?
So at the core, all of this is about enabling humans and computers to understand what is going on. honestly, a lot of what we see in the cloud native space is stuff which we've seen years and decades ago with different names. The underlying concepts are all more or less the same. CGI bin was the OG serverless. I recently did a deep dive into Kubernetes networking, and it's basically what I did working at an ISP 20 years ago, and it's still the same stuff with the exception of VXLAN now being available and going through a few iterations. And now the thing of VXLAN, which is actually stable and working, is used there. But beyond this, but you still see MPLS and VPLS and such in many cloud providers. So even those bits and pieces are all there. Interconnections between clouds are always based on BGP. Like all of this is super old. It's all the same concepts. It's the sausage is the components are the same. But there is one thing where previously you might have 1 to 20 servers which ran a thing. Now you've been able to split this into containers, into machines, into serverless functions, blah 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 blah. So while the basic building blocks of how this works are still the same, the ability to scale out is obviously a different one. You're able to scale out along more and new and different axes as opposed to a few years ago. That also means, in particular, the automation around the scale out means that there's a lot more context which is ever changing, which you need to ingest. And that is still mainly on the humans. Because if companies could get away without their domain subject matter experts, they would not have them, because people are expensive. Yet, every tech company you're talking to is investing super aggressively into their people and trying to hire left and right for precisely this reason. Of course, you need the humans who actually know what that thing is about. Of course, the dirty secret is you don't have a generic AI ML thing. Like with highly specialized things, that obviously works, and it will keep breaking new ground, and it will keep changing us as an industry. But it will not fundamentally change. Like the fact that you have MP3 and basically changed how the music industry works does not change the fact that you still need musicians and composers and such. So circling back, it is about enabling those humans to understand those ever-changing systems. By extension, also enabling other computer systems to understand those computer systems. Of course, you do have very nice properties, in particular, for example, for metrics when it comes to AI, ML, and such, and all those buzzwords. But even the understanding is not the core. The core to me, and here I'm speaking as someone who was on call for 11 years without pause, even during holidays, and yes, I was stupid. And young and just an idiot. And anyone who listens to this, don't do this ever. It's not worth it. It is about making all of this good and bearable for humans. I honestly do want people to be able to sleep, and like I want alerts to only wake someone up when it's imminently customer facing. There's no automation or resources which can compensate for this. Or if it's imminently facing, of course, you can predict that your resources will run out in X amount of time, at which time it also becomes urgent. Like, but unless it's both important and urgent, I don't want anyone to be woken up about anything. Of course, you can just deal with it during business hours. And if it's a long weekend, whatever, Monday is fine, unless something breaks. But to be able to make this call and to be able to actually pre-process all the data to the point where you can, at the core, have this alert which does wake someone up or does not wake someone up. You need all this pre-processing. To get new people into the space and to uplift people with more and deeper understanding of their systems, you need a way to actually go in depth on your systems and to actually understand what is happening, to extract new data, to extract new meaning from all this flood of stuff. That is the one part. On the other hand, how to do this? Again, I'm highly biased. If I were to start today, or if someone asked me how to start today, I would obviously be telling them to look at Loki and the Tempo and to look at Cortex and Prometheus, because that's where I chose to go towards to, and where I chose to work towards. So I am biased, but I also worked quite a lot to get the ecosystem to the space where this is there. If we are talking on the instrumenting side, personally, I would still choose. I mean, as of today, I would choose the agent or the Prometheus client libraries, I would probably just do syslog and pipe everything in Loki and deal with it there, because it's just for myself the better trade-off in between indexing everything and having a data lake, which is a euphemism for never look at it. At least unless you do data warehouse and batch analysis later, but that's useless for alerting.
Maybe you should mention to our audience, we didn't properly introduce, but essentially both Grafana, Loki, and Tempo are three open source projects provided by Grafana Lab, your company, that address the metrics visualization, the log analytics, and the tracing respectively. Do you want to say a few words to introduce it?
Sure. So let's start with Grafana. Grafana is the single pane of glass, but the important bit to everyone who hates the term single pane of glass, usually the pitch when someone tells you there is a single pane of glass, the implicit non-said thing is, as soon as you migrate everything to what that one vendor is selling you, then and only then will you have that single pane of glass. And that is A, super expensive, and B, it's not realistic because you will always have disparate systems unless you have a really tiny org. And even in tiny orgs, you sometimes have this. And that is absolutely fine. It's not realistic to have everything in sync all the time, because if everything was in sync all the time, we will still be using a single mainframe standing somewhere in the head office, and maybe even not in the head office, because else you could not migrate, you could not uplift your technology stack if you didn't have the ability to just detach different bits and pieces and just upgrade or never upgrade them at this different point in time. Not upgrading legacy is just another word for actually makes money. So a lot of the things are just not touched because they are actually doing what they need to be doing, and they don't need to have the newest bling and such. So Grafana does not do this. Grafana supports, I don't know how many data sources, but it's in the two figures. There's a lot more data sources. Like all of this is open source, but there's a lot more data sources which are closed source. Like the rough sniff test is if the data source is paid, then the data source plugin for Grafana tends also to be paid. Like for Prometheus, it's just open source. If you have, I don't know, Jira, that's a commercial plugin. But Jira itself is also commercial, and you're already paying a lot more for Jira than you would be paying for the plugin. But the point is, you can just implement it yourself if you so choose. Like Jira has an API, Grafana has an API, which gets you to the sniff test of, does the prospective user have more money than time or more time than money, which is a little bit of where we try to go and keep it fair to the wider community. So Grafana really believes in this big tent where everyone should be able to bring their data into that one shared system, and we don't artificially lock anyone out or anything. It doesn't always make immediate business sense, but it makes long-term community and business sense to really be free for everyone to participate and to visualize what they have under that shared umbrella, where they can just take from their business analytics and their customer mail bombing tool and their PR thing and their operations thing, and then correlate all that data into insights into how that one sales cycle went or what have you. And like myself, I set something up for legal compliance where the assistant to the CEO just pulled out certain key stats on services provided and then gave them to the authorities for compliance and regulation reasons. And that all went through Grafana and Prometheus. Of course, why wouldn't I be doing this? Why wouldn't I enable her to also look at other things and enable the engineers to look at those metrics? So that is Grafana. And I mean, probably I talked already too much about this because everyone...
Yeah, we are a bit about to run out of time. I do want to leave you time to say a few words just about Loki and Tempo, if you want to briefly say what their mission statement is.
So Loki is like Prometheus, but for logs. And that is... I think it's either Tom or myself who came up with the term. And it's actually meant that way. It is taking the thinking of Prometheus and then applying this to logs instead of traces. Like you have this super powerful functional vector language where you can just work with insane amounts of data very quickly. You have this super easy way to get stuff into the system, and you don't like, it's not artificially made hard to get stuff into the system. It's done as easy as possible on purpose. So basically, Loki is a highly scalable solution to deal with your logging data or generic events. I know people who have images in there and such. The beauty of it is only the labels are indexed. And labels are the same as in Prometheus, which is where this interplay is coming from. So it's super easy to jump in between those two. You can jump from your logs because you are using the same metrics, so they make immediate sense to seamlessly jump between your metrics and your logs because they are just seamless between each other. And we don't index anything in the actual opaque string or blob at the end. So you don't have that compute and everything cost of indexing everything like you have with other projects and vendors, but you do have an index where it actually matters. You don't have the data lake, and that mirrors a lot of SQL properties where you have a few indexed columns and the rest is not indexed, and that makes a ton of sense to me. I really like the sweet spot of where we chose to put the indexing. But again, I'm biased, of course, Prometheus. Tempo is the tracing bit for this. With an extra nicety where you have exemplars. Exemplars are basically just IDs which you can attach to your to your logs and your metrics. And as you know the properties of your logs and your metrics, you already know if that is a relevant trace or not. You don't have that needle in haystack problem. You don't need to ingest and analyze your traces as they come in to try and extract meaning from them, because you already have meaning which has been defined before by domain or subject matter experts, which is attached to those traces and spans, which means you can also jump seamlessly between those. Of course, you have those indices and you have reverse indices. They can just jump seamlessly between all of those. Tempo is also gaining search functionality, because that is just a user need and it's being covered, obviously. But the happy path, as it were, is to use Prometheus or Cortex or Thanos for your metrics, or some of the other compatible storage engines for your metrics. Loki, as of today, of course, it's the only one for your logs. And I mean, I'm biased. Tempo for your traces and your spans.
But they're not part of the CNCF ecosystem, right? It's important to emphasize, unlike Prometheus and Cortex and Thanos.
They're part of the CNCF ecosystem. They're not CNCF projects. But there you have to define what is a community, how wide do ecosystems reach, blah, 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 blah. In my opinion, it's most certainly part of the ecosystem, because ecosystems go wider and span different communities, at least in my definition. But they are not CNCF projects, correct? They're Grafana Labs projects.
Is there, by the way, a plan to make them part of the CNCF?
Not as of right now.
Great. So I think we're a bit out over the time, but I'm glad we had the time to at least cover these, and maybe we'll have more opportunities to discuss them in future episodes. But definitely interesting to see all the breadth of open source that is available today to set up a new observability stack for the users. I'd like to thank you very much, Richie, for joining me for this episode and for sharing your thoughts. Thanks you very much. And this episode was a bit long, so we'll skip the news bits for today. I will definitely share some of the news pieces that we discussed during the episode about OpenTelemetry and about OpenMetrics and so on, as part of the links attached to the episode. So thank you very much for Richie, and thank you very much for all the listeners who joined us today. All the episodes, as always, are available on your favorite podcast apps or on YouTube. So look up OpenObservability Talks. You can also reach out on the website OpenObservability.io, so you can find all the links through there. And do, if you haven't joined one of our live streams, do join us. We stream the episodes live on Twitch and YouTube Live, so check out the live streams, and you can tune in and you can ask questions, have comments, and interact with the episode. And follow us on Twitter at OpenObserve for updates, to share your comments, suggestions, news bits. You can also submit CFPs for yourselves to talk and take part in the community here around Open Observability. So reach out. You can reach out to me directly at Horovitz, HOROVATS. And most importantly, would be more than happy to listen and to hear feedback and to get more people involved. Thank you very much for listening. I was Dotan Horvitz, and goodbye until next month's episode. Thank you.